According to the internet, the rapture was supposed to happen yesterday. And that got me thinking, where did the idea of the rapture even come from? How did a concept of millions of people just disappearing from the face of the earth move from an obscure theological theory to one of the most popular end-time beliefs of modern Christianity? Let's trace it back to Ireland, 1820, where our story begins with a man named John Nelson Darby. But first, let's set the mood. Ireland in the 1820s was rough. Most of the population were Catholic, tenant farmers living in poverty. They worked small plots of land, often owned by absentee Protestant landowners who were busy yucking it up in Dublin or England and would just pop by once in a while to collect the rents, but they would never reinvest the money back into the farms or the people working it. In 1820, religion was one of the most defining features of the period. It was the old Protestants v. Catholics, and while the majority of Ireland were Catholic and they were poor, most of the economic and political power were held by the small elite group of Protestants, who were also supported by the established Church of Ireland. Politically, the country was restless and violent. Secret farming societies like groups called the White Boys were carrying out nighttime raids to protest increasing rents, evictions, and tithes, which came in the form of mandatory payments to the Protestant church. The Catholics were super ticked about that. John Nelson Darby, by all accounts, was a brilliant but intense and stubborn man. He was raised in an upper-middle-class Anglo-Irish Protestant family, first studying law and then later turning to theology. He became ordained by the Church of Ireland, but after getting the ick over dirty politics and the corruption of established churches, he decided to create his own Christian movement. In the 1820s and 1830s, Darby helped found the Plymouth Brethren, and I've been around long enough to physically recoil from any organization that includes the word brethren. Let's suspend judgment for a bit. This group was non-denominational and rejected church hierarchy and silly little rituals like, I don't know, burning incense and ringing bells and wearing robes and pointy hats. I'm just guessing. Maybe they were against singing. I don't know. But what they were really for were small, independent Bible studies, and they believed that everyone could and should be allowed to read the Bible and interpret it for themselves, which is pretty progressive. Now, Darby was especially fascinated with biblical philosophy, and he interpreted books like Daniel and Revelation literally. During this period of his life when the entire world seemed completely unstable, name a country in Europe and they were going through some kind of revolution. There was the social upheaval after the Industrial Revolution. Empires were rising and falling and national borders were being redrawn. Where people might interpret this as just political unrest, Darby saw this as a prophecy being fulfilled. To him, kingdoms rising and falling weren't just random events. They were exactly the kind of things that Scripture had foretold. It was at this time that he began to introduce the theory of instantaneous rapture. He based it largely on 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 through 17, where the Apostle Paul describes believers being caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Darby believed this was a literal, singular, global event, that Christians could just vanish at any moment and leave the rest of the world behind. Interpreting the signs around him as a countdown clock, he believed that the rapture was the next scheduled event. Remember, this is 200 years ago. Keep that in mind. So Darby died in 1882 at the age of 82, having never witnessed the rapture, unfortunately. But his ideas didn't die with him. 17 years later, in 1909, an American theologian named Cyrus Scofield published the Scofield Reference Bible. Scofield was a major simp for Darby's teachings, and that was pretty apparent with his version of the Bible. His book included extensive commentary and cross-references that were printed right alongside the scripture. And he spoke about Darby's rapture theory with such authority that people accepted it without hesitation. From there, the idea of the rapture moved into the mainstream through what's called a prophecy conference, which was basically like a Christian workshop for the end of times. They were really popular in the 1920s and 1930s. People from around the world, clergy and otherwise, would get together and they would just work each other into a frenzy about the ideas of the rapture and the second coming, and interpreting books like Revelation literally. And they would just get so pumped about these ideas of being ascended into heaven, and they would go around high-fiving and slapping each other on the butts and pinching their nipples. I mean, the after party of these conferences had to have been pretty awesome. Anyway, the people that went to these conferences almost treated the Bible like a blueprint for world events and what was to come. Darby's rapture theory became a reoccurring event and was preached with such urgency that these people believed it would happen at any moment. This is now 100 years ago, if you're keeping track. Fast forward to 1995, when a new generation encountered the rapture in a very different form. Fiction. The Left Behind series was a banger. And those books were just flying off the shelves. They took Darby's 19th century ideas of rapture, tribulation, and literal prophecy and wrapped them up into an action-packed series. They sold millions of copies and inspired things like film, video games, and graphic novels. And I just have to find the Left Behind video game. I can't think of anything dumber. So the guy wakes up and everyone he knows is gone, and so the point of the game is to press A, B, down, up until you find Jesus? I don't know, it sounds wild. Anyway, this cemented the idea of the rapture as a central belief in the American evangelical culture, which I myself had the privilege of growing up in. And I remember when the Left Behind series came out, when I saw it, I was at first terrified and then almost immediately relieved, because of course I would be one of the ones ascending into heaven. And after that, I was just plumb excited. So suddenly what began as a niche theological theory was now mainstream pop culture. And for many, it was no longer just an abstract idea, it was an actual expectation. The thought of being whisked away from a troubled earth certainly sounds appealing, especially in times of crisis. But if you're waiting for the rapture countdown to hit 0, I wouldn't hold your breath. The roots of this idea don't lie in ancient Christianity, but the imagination of a 19th century clergyman and the publishing success that followed him. I'll say that again. The idea of a rapture is a modern idea that's only been around for the last 200 years. So unplug your laminator, Becky. The rapture isn't happening. Not now, not ever. But then that got me thinking. Scientifically, what would happen to a human body if it did ascend to heaven? I'm glad you asked. Scientifically speaking, what would happen to your mortal coil if the rapture really did occur? Well, let's send a human body gently upward and theorize about what might happen. We'll assume no violent acceleration, but also no protective suit or life support. Starting at sea level and floating up the first mile or two, the air does slowly begin to thin and the temperatures drop, but for a passive floating body, nothing catastrophic happens here. In the next 2 to 4 miles, usable oxygen is dramatically reduced. Mental confusion, impaired coordination, and loss of consciousness can happen within seconds to minutes. There is a long way to go before we hit the edge of space, and the brain is already starving for oxygen. Between 4 to 7.5 miles up, temperatures continue to drop to negative 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's frostbite territory. You've just barely begun your journey, and at this point you're already completely unconscious. For the next 20 miles or so, temperatures actually begin to start warming up again thanks to ozone heating. But don't get too cozy, because by now atmospheric pressure is so low that the fluids in your body begin to boil. The exposed fluids of your eyes, mouth, and respiratory surfaces vaporize, and those areas dry out and begin to stiffen. The good news, your internal organs are still mostly intact. Another 20 miles and you've struck icy temperatures again, the coldest in Earth's atmosphere, down to negative 130 degrees Fahrenheit. 20 more miles and all the juice in your body is gone and you're just a little dried up piece of human jerky floating up to meet your maker. Now, the boundary between the Earth's atmosphere and outer space is internationally recognized as the Kármán line. If you somehow manage to cross this line and drift into orbit, your body has gone from jerky to mummy to a human peanut brittle. Here's another thought. All the media imagery I've seen of people being raptured, they're not being launched into space like a rocket. They're floating briskly at best. So let's assume they're floating at about 4 miles per hour. It would take you 15 and a half hours, roughly, to travel from sea level to the Kármán line. And you probably didn't bring any snacks, did you? And how long is this heavenly journey anyway? No one knows. But you'd eventually need to pick up the pace if you expected to get to the pearly gates before last call. And what happens if, worst case scenario, you miss your celestial exit? You could spend a long time in space looking for the next on-ramp. In the vacuum of space beyond the Kármán line, the body doesn't stay perfectly preserved forever, although the decomposition happens a lot more slowly than it does on Earth. Over the next several weeks, radiation from cosmic rays and solar particles gradually break down cellular structures, protein, and your DNA. Also, micrometeoroid collisions are gradually chipping away at your mummified shell. And hey, there's nothing wrong with a micrometeoroid, okay? In a lot of ways, they're better than an average-sized meteor. But I digress. Without bacteria and fungi, you don't really decompose the way you would on Earth. And it could take centuries or millennia for cosmic radiation and micrometeorite erosion to chip away at your little body until eventually you just turn into a bunch of tiny fragments or cosmic dust. Anyway, I just thought that was a fun little look at what would happen to your body as you ascend through space, atmospheric layer by atmospheric layer. But the thing that's really stuck with me through this little rabbit hole that I got to go on is every generation thinks that they're at the doorstep of the end times. And I'm not just talking about the dozens of end of the world predictions that have even happened in the last 10 to 20 years. It's documented that at the very least every 100 years, people get themselves worked up into an absolute frenzy looking around at what's happening in the world and thinking this must be the end of times. It couldn't possibly get any worse than this. And I don't even know if it does get worse than this. I mean, things seem pretty crappy right now, but in 1820 Ireland, they were pretty crappy then too, maybe even worse. But this is a good example of if you're looking for a problem and if you want evidence that Jesus is coming and the rapture is about to happen, you'll find it. And you're gonna look foolish as hell when you wake up the next day and nothing happened. So take it easy, everyone. But just in case, if you do ever find yourself about to be raptured, as quickly as you can, I would expel every bodily fluid possible by any means possible. Because the thought of boiling from the inside is super unappealing. Not how you want to show up to heaven. Anyway, this has been fun. Thanks for joining me down this rabbit hole. I'm Eve Ruin, and I've just ruined the rapture. Okay, love you. Bye-bye.